Great. So a very warm welcome, and we'll wait a couple of minutes for additional attendees, and then we'll make a start this afternoon. So I'm very pleased to welcome you. My name is Dr. John Reid, and I'll be leading the first part of today's session, and then I will be inviting questions from the audience throughout the session. And I'm joined by a panel of guest speakers who are going to respond to some of your questions. So do feel welcome to put questions either using the Q&A or the chat function. We'll be keeping an eye on both as we go through today's session. So again, thank you, Will. There's encouragement there again to pop any questions you might have as we go through into the Q&A function or the chat function, whichever you'd prefer to use. So I'm really excited to welcome you here this afternoon. The focus of today's session, I think, is particularly important given current sort of circumstances. I don't think it matters what sort of role you have in education. I think this is, I hope, relevant to your kind of professional experiences. So the title there is School plus Compassion equals Wellbeing. And just to give you a little bit of background about my own sort of interest in this area, the focus of my doctoral research was very much around teachers' emotional work, support for their well-being, and the role of compassion. So I'm going to be providing a kind of brief overview of some of my sort of doctoral research as we go through. I'll be beginning with, setting the scene, particularly around concerns about well-being in schools. In addition to concerns about the well-being of children and young people, there are also concerns presently around the well-being of teachers and other professionals in school. And I think that's really kind of important to recognise. In fact, today, the Education Support Partnership are also offering a webinar which is talking about the emotional dimensions of teachers' work. And that comes off the back of the publication of a recent report, came out yesterday, called Teaching a New Reality. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the Education Support Partnership website. You can download that report, and it's kind of really insightful around some of the experiences that are having an impact on well-being in schools. I'm really interested in the role of compassion and particularly compassion-focused ideas to support teachers. And at the end of the session, I'll be promoting the idea of compassion-focused education, which is something that I arrived at the end of my doctoral research. And I'll be encouraging you also, if you're interested on social media, to join the Compassion Ed Revolution, which is something I've been promoting over a number of years. So do feel welcome to add any comments you might have throughout today's session using that hashtag Compassion Ed Revolution. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome our panel of guests this afternoon. So we've got Laura Dennis, and at the moment we've got Patrick Alexander. So I'm just going to say a little bit about our speakers before we move in. So Laura is an experienced teacher and leader working as an education outreach lead at the Mulberry Bush organisation, which is a prodigious residential therapeutic community school that is celebrating 75 years of its history presently. She's also a senior associate member of APPCIOS. Laura and her team focus on working with schools, other professionals and organisations to develop support for children and young people, and particularly those children with kind of more complex social, emotional, mental health and attachment needs. I know Laura's going to talk a bit about how we can support children with those particular needs, and also how we need to really support the adults that work with those children as part of the Q&A. Laura is also currently developing the capacity and strategy of her outreach team, and her current focus is on the development of the newly created emotional and social curriculum and supporting schools and other settings across the UK through supervision, which again is something that I think is really important for schools to think about in terms of how we might support the emotional work of our colleagues in schools. She's co-leading on the Nurturing Schools project in Oxfordshire, working with 4 schools to develop their nurturing practices at whole school level. So a huge range of expertise, and I'm very grateful, Laura, that you've been able to join us this afternoon. I'm also very pleased to welcome my colleague, Professor Patrick Alexander. Patrick is our resident anthropologist. He's also the Director of Research and Consultancy at Oxford Brookes University. And Patrick, I hope, will be offering some considerations later on around the concept of intellectual well-being and its relevance for authentic self-actualization, which I think, again, is really important around teacher well-being of both teachers and students. So a very warm welcome to our panel this afternoon. So I'm going to now proceed with thinking about the aims of today's session, and that's really about how we can work together to create compassionate school communities. So that's the kind of aim of today's session. And I think that's really important given the kind of current concerns presently, particularly around mental health, children and teachers, and a lack of kind of recognition within the policy context. Before we start thinking about compassion, I would like you just to pause for a minute and think about a time when you actually showed compassion to somebody. And I don't know who that somebody might be, but I'd like you to think about where you were. Why did you feel the need to show compassion? How did you show compassion? And how did that experience make the other feel? So just a few moments to reflect on those questions before we proceed. Okay, so as we move through the session, there will be some questions for you to pause and kind of reflect on, really. And I think that's particularly important given Professor Barry Carpenter's concerns, and these were 6 years ago. He was suggesting that what we see in this new generation of children, particularly those with complex learning needs, is vulnerability, particularly in emotional development. And his suggestion at the time was that vulnerable learners are fragile, and it's our quest as educators, or should be, to think really carefully about how we can support our children to become emotionally strong. And I think compassion might give us a way of thinking about the kind of social and emotional development needs of our children and young people. You know, of course, we've had very difficult global context recently, and Barry was talking about these sort of concerns pre-pandemic, but over the last couple of years, the NHS digital, a longitudinal study, have kind of recognised an increase in the number of children experiencing needs around their mental health. In older adolescents, that's now increased to 1 in 4, so a quarter of our young people experiencing needs around their emotional well-being, and 1 in 6 for kind of younger children as well. So, you know, wherever we're working in education, we're guaranteed to be working with actually quite a significant minority of children that might experience concerns about their sort of emotional well-being. The other thing to really think about is when we've experienced compassion from others. So again, a moment to reflect, where were you? Who showed compassion to you? How did they show that compassion, and how did you feel? And again, thinking particularly about the experience of compassion from others, that I think is such an important aspect of our professional experiences, particularly given Professor Catherine Weir's suggestion that wellbeing in school begins with the staff. We are the front line of this work, and it's hard for us to be genuinely motivated to promote emotional and social wellbeing in others if we feel uncared for and burnt out ourselves. And, you know, concerning the Education Support Partnership publication, again, released yesterday, Teaching a New Reality, highlights the significance, really, of emotional distress amongst our sort of professional, you know, colleagues in whatever role they're working in. And education can be quite a distressing experience, actually. This is a kind of scale of distress. And I suppose before I began presenting today, I was probably around that 30, mild anxiety, a little bit nervous, and but actually, I'm hoping it hasn't interfered with any functioning presently. But we do recognise that many of our children actually arrive in school with much higher levels of anxiety, maybe up at 60, moderate to strong anxiety. Some children actually quite distressed around their kind of experiences around education. This week, of course, is SATS week, and depending on how schools kind of explore those experiences with children, you might be finding in your schools, again, quite high levels of anxiety, not only in the children you're working with, but perhaps with your colleagues and perhaps with parents and carers and so on. So, actually what we've got to be thinking about is how we can minimize, prevent or alleviate some of those experiences of distress. And I think compassion might offer us a way to do that. When we think about our current education system, it's very much sort of, focused around these four areas, I think: competition, comparison, compliance and control. And I think we should be moving more towards an education system which is more compassion focused, which exhibits more care, encourages more connection and facilitates more collaboration. So I think, we're moving, or hopefully moving, away from some of these experiences that might create distress into these kind of different experiences. As I suggested previously, my doctoral research was very much around the emotional work of teachers, and teaching is a relational activity. It involves lots of different emotional experiences with a range of different kind of people, as I say, children, our colleagues, parents and carers and so on. And during our work, we can experience a variety of kind of complex emotions that can positively or negatively influence our well-being. And from the minute we wake up to the minute we leave and the minute we go to bed, probably, we're often kind of thinking about these complex emotional experiences and how we might navigate those in the social space of school. This emotional work is very different from our physical or intellectual work because it involves those emotional experiences, and it involves us thinking about the emotional impact of our behaviour on others, but also thinking about how the behaviour of others impacts on those that we work with. So it's very much around kind of social interactions in particular social contexts. And we're required as teachers to regulate our emotions, feelings and behaviours constantly. And that's to do with the environment we're working with. So often, in fact, this is what teachers do very, very well. They're exhibiting care and enthusiasm and sensitivity to ensure that others feel safe and are comfortable. But sometimes we have to hide or disguise our feelings, such as fatigue and tiredness, anxiety, or maybe even fear in some situations. So, we're constantly regulating our emotions, and we may not express our authentic emotions and feelings. And I think that's what this emotional work is all about. So now I'm going to just very briefly give you some insight into the work that I was particularly interested in when I was developing my doctoral research, which is around the importance of compassion in education. So again, a minute to pause here. What words do you associate with compassion? What words would you use to describe compassion? So just again, a minute of reflection before we move forward. Okay, so from the perspective of a sort of compassion-focused therapeutic way of thinking about compassion, this is Professor Paul Gilbert. So over the last sort of 45 years, Professor Gilbert has been developing this idea of sort of compassion-focused therapy. And for Professor Paul Gilbert, compassion is related to a sensitivity to suffering in ourselves or others, and a commitment to try and alleviate or prevent it. So there's a motivation associated with compassion. Here are some other definitions that also recognize that kind of motivation. Sorry, gone one too far there, but it's about sensitivity. It's about recognition of difficulty and distress in ourselves and others, and it's about doing something about it. So it's very much thinking about the well-being of ourselves and others. And it draws on a variety of different kind of disciplines, really very much interdisciplinary, evolutionary, developmental. Most religions have a focus on compassion as being very central, but this approach draws particularly around Buddhist psychology and the notion of social psychology and neuroscience as well. So essentially is underpinned by a philosophy of compassionate humanism, which I think sometimes might be missing from our educational experiences. But essentially, it's a way of helping others to develop a motivation, a compassionate motivation for themselves and others, but also to be open to receiving compassion from others, to recognize when compassion is shown to us. So here are some books I'd recommend, particularly from Professor Paul Gilbert, really giving an in-depth insight into the kind of ideas that underpin the compassion-focused work. Again, compassion is thought about, compassion for ourselves, compassion for others, and compassion from others. So this kind of flow of compassion is really important to recognize. And it's founded on principles of attachment theory. So actually, increasing emotional safety, for example. It also recognizes the work of Stephen Porges, the sort of polyvagal theory. And that's the idea that throughout our development, we are evolved to recognize both risk and safety. And so the compassion stuff works around a recognition of these experiences of risk and safety. Initially, infants are dependent on those around them to create those experiences of safety, and as we develop, we sort of experience social connectedness and co-regulation with others, and that's kind of, again, really important to recognize. So you might be familiar with polyvagal theory, particularly around the notion that there are experiences, physiological experiences, that can lead to anxiety and panic and so on. I mean, there are other ways that we can support individuals when they're experiencing those through social engagement, connection, and so on. So I think polyvagal theory is really kind of quite useful. Professor Paul Gilbert developed this idea about an emotional regulation system called the affect regulation system. And he called, he recognizes these three kind of main systems that manage our emotions. So there's drive, which is associated with achieving goals. It's associated with consuming and accomplishing tasks, a very positive motivation. There's also a threat protection system, which is how we manage threats. It's an evolutionary perspective around seeking safety. And there's this sort of soothing system, which is much more related to relational experiences. When we stop, we slow down, we rest, we experience emotional safety and care and kindness. From a compassion-focused perspective, it's recognized that actually, experience in education and in broader society actually sort of trigger these sort of drive and threat-based systems, and that can lead to experience of kind of difficulty or distress. So if stress and distress is experienced, it's because often this sort of drive is resource seeking and so on, get out of balance with this kind of experience of contentment, because it can lead to experience of threat. And I think some of our children this week might be feeling those sort of anxiety because of this sort of drive to achieve in school at this particular time. So you might have considered various kind of attributes that might be associated with compassion. And from a compassion focused perspective, they identify 6 particular attributes that are listed here. So care, sensitivity, sympathy, tolerating distress, empathy, and non-judgment. And those are important because they can help alleviate some of those experiences, because it's about care for self and others. It's about recognizing distress and doing something about it. It's being sympathetic, being emotionally moved by the feelings of others. For adults working with children that exhibit, high levels of emotional need, it's actually being able to tolerate some of those difficult experiences, those high levels of emotion that some children might experience on a daily basis, and actually empathizing, really trying to understand what those feelings and behaviors are all about in a kind of non-judgmental way. So not criticizing or rejecting those feelings, but actually recognizing, and sort of appreciating those feelings. So my research looked at how teachers experience compassion in their school settings, compassion from and for others. And for Phoenix, it wasn't about this. So it was more than cupcakes in pigeonholes. I think that's a lovely gesture, but actually it's more about a sort of culture and ethos of well-being. So there were informal and non-structured approaches in these schools that supported well-being, that was about relational experiences with colleagues. It was about openness. It was about authenticity. It was about being emotionally present for our colleagues and all that kind of thing, but also formal and structured opportunities. And I'm hoping Laura might talk a little bit more about reflective spaces and supervision later, but some schools have these kind of very structured opportunities to talk about the emotional aspects of the work that can really help teachers to explore their emotional experiences together, actually. And that's really important to sort of coming to, a shared understanding of where these feelings and experiences might be coming from. So my research revealed that teachers needed the space and the time to be able to talk about the emotional experiences that they were going through on a daily basis, because actually I found that the emotional work was much more pervasive and complex than is being recognised presently in research and in the current policy context. Teachers think about this emotional work often when they're not in school. So maybe before they get to school, maybe after school, at weekends, during holidays, and they need this space to be able to talk about this kind of work. So again, a moment to pause and reflect. Another really important aspect of this sort of compassion focused way of thinking is about self-compassion. So when did you, experience compassion for yourself? Where were you? What did you do? And how did you feel? So a moment just to reflect on those questions. So just a moment to share a reflection. Before this session, I was feeling a little worried and a little anxious about the presentation. So I stood in the garden, I listened to the bird song, and I was able to focus my attention on the blackbird, and the blackbird song, just for those few minutes, really helped me to sort of physiologically, rest and relax a little bit before this particular presentation. So that was a moment of calm before I started this particular presentation. So there are a number of colleagues, both nationally and internationally, that are really interested in the role of compassion in education. So on my bottom left there is Dr. Mary Welford, and she was the first person I read about whose work has explored compassion-focused ideas in school. She has a number of open access publications and a number of books which I'll be recommending. Elaine Beaumont above her is actually a psychotherapist and trained psychotherapist, and she's written a couple of wonderful books that might be recommended. This is Marcela Matos in the middle here, who's been doing some work around compassion in Portugal. So I'll share some of the international work. Dr. Chris Irons, top right there. I was lucky enough to meet at a conference. He offers an introduction to compassion-focused therapeutic ideas and runs a really useful website with some useful kind of ways of thinking about compassion. And at the bottom right there is Professor Frankie Moratos, who has developed a kind of, initiatives around compassion-focused or compassion-based initiatives in schools. It's really interesting to look at the evidence in terms of the positive impacts of whole school approaches that have compassion at the core of their work. So in 2015, Welford and Langmead undertook some research in a secondary school, and she continues to work with a number of schools, actually. This article was published by the British Psychological Society, but the findings were that this kind of way of thinking around the importance of compassion increased staff well-being. There was a reduction in staff absence due to sickness. There was an increase in parental engagement because this became very much a whole school approach involving parents and carers, and a decrease in low-level disruptive behaviour and exclusion, something else I'm particularly interested in. I'm actually presently campaigning around the aspiration to eliminate exclusions in our schools for a charity I work in. And this is really great for me to see that by focusing on compassion, we might be able to kind of, have a positive impact on student engagement and behaviour. This is one of the books I'd like to recommend by Elaine Beaumont and Mary Welford, The Kindness Workbook. It's just a wonderful book around compassionate, creative ways to think about your own well-being. I would consider using that for myself as an adult, but also there might be some interesting activities there to work with children as well. Frankie Matus has a number of publications, again, by the psychologist, and her work, which is an open access publication, the references are at the end of this presentation, found that focus on compassion supported adults to cope with their students' behaviour, to actually take a step back and really reflect on, the reasons for the behaviour. What was the behaviour communicating? And I think that's really important. As adults, how we interpret children's behaviour influences our responses. Also thinking about the role of self-compassion in supporting the emotional demands of participants' professional roles. That was very much the focus of my doctoral research. Conflicts with colleagues, I'm sure we don't have conflicts with colleagues, but compassion was found in this particular study to help alleviate or prevent some of those difficulties with colleagues potentially, and also with some of the difficulties we might experience from disengaging from our professional roles. Sometimes we come home and we still think about the work that we've been involved in during the day. Compassion focused ways can help us to disengage from our role. This is more recent research here from Matos in Portugal, and her research found an increase in self-compassion, an increase in compassion to others, positive emotional affect in terms of the way we think about our professional experiences, reduction in anxiety, depression, and concerns about compassion. And those teachers that scored higher in self-criticism, which is also sadly an experience that many teachers have around their professional roles, revealed improvements following their participation in the programme. But there's quite a wealth of evidence now that recognises the impact of compassion on our professional roles and the impact on then the children that we work with. This is Dr. Chris Irons here, and again, a wonderful book here, the Compassion Mind Workbook. Really interesting activities there to support compassion for self. And I really like this book around difficult emotions. A lot of the emotional work that you experience involves kind of quite difficult emotions that often we don't have the space to talk about. So that's another book that I hope you might find useful. Oh, now I've put that in as a little reminder. That's me at a national conference called Compassion in Schools. And there's Professor Paul Gilbert and the other speakers I've recommended today with Professor Catherine Weir there. But look out for their next annual conference. It's a gathering really of people that are really interested in promoting the importance of compassion in education. The Compassion Mind Foundation is a really useful website, and it's hosted by Professor Paul Gilbert and others, but lots of really useful resources there. And Balanced Minds also has a number of kind of practical introductions to why compassion might be so important. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at those websites in your own time. So, I think the timing's gone pretty well there. I was aiming to provide a half-an-hour overview, and by my clock, I've made that just 29 minutes. So I think I'm 14 seconds ahead of where I hoped I would be. So I'm really pleased now to welcome our guest speakers, again, Laura Dennis and Professor Patrick Alexander. Just before we kind of move into our questions from the audience, which I hope you feel very welcome to share. Just wondered what your immediate responses were to that opening presentation, Laura or Patrick.
Shall I go first?
Go for it.
So I suppose, as you were sort of sharing that, John, I think I was very much thinking about our own practice and what we do at the Mulberry Bush. And again, referring back just to reflective spaces and supervisions that we provide for the staff. So at the Mulberry Bush, which is a therapeutic community for children who have suffered significant early trauma, we offer reflective spaces and supervisions to all of the staff, whether you work as a teacher or one of the care staff in the care homes, you're an admin assistant, you're a cleaner, you're a cook. Everyone gets reflective space and supervision, which just allows us to sort of really support people and support them to feel supported and process the work alongside these children in a safe capacity. Like you mentioned, so many of us in education and in other sectors, when we're working with challenges and complexities with these children and young people, we take them home and we don't always know how to process them safely. And there's times when I think, I've heard of cases where people have taken that home, maybe discussed anonymously, obviously, situations that are arising at work, but then it's caused massive sort of family disputes. And and because it's caused a bit of a friction between partners and what have you, or there's been people that haven't said anything at all and then they've just ended up being burnt out and unfortunately signed off of work. So I think this, compassion is so important, and we've got to sort of hold it as a very high accord. And like you said, if the well-being of the staff isn't there, then the well-being for the children isn't going to happen.
My immediate response to your considerations there is that I've worked in a number of settings that support children with really complex social, emotional, mental health needs, and some schools I think support this work really well. They recognise it, they acknowledge it. It's part of the professional work to actually develop this kind of shared understanding about the impact of this kind of work. And I've worked in other places where that has been neglected or ignored or not talked about. And I think they're kind of very different ways of appreciating this aspect of the work. So in terms of what colleagues could bring to these kind of reflective spaces, what might colleagues share in these spaces?
So for some examples being, if there'd been a particularly difficult incident or a difficult situation about a child, or even just a feeling, got to be an acknowledgement, and quite often it's the unspoken word in a lot of schools, that it's okay to have feelings about children. Quite often I think it's seen as unprofessional to voice your opinions about children and how you feel from working alongside them. But it's very natural and normal for us to all have different feelings from working with different children. So those experiences can be brought up in reflective spaces, but we also might explore sort of dynamics which are arising within the team. There's always going to be, I know we said, you mentioned that actually, hopefully there's not falling outs, but that there always is a falling out, and there always is some friction or tension between staff members, especially when you're working in really difficult situations with complex cases. There's a lot of projection of emotion and feelings from the children we work with, which we can carry and absolutely do carry. And so it's important that those spaces, we are able to sort of explore that with one another. I made a comment the other day and I don't know if you took it in the right way. Is everything okay? And just that's a safe space, and building those trusting teamwork relationships within the reflective spaces means that actually as an adult team, we work better, our well-being's in a better place, and then we are in a better place to support the children. So it just feeds down the.
Again, I think that was a real sort of important finding from my research actually, was that, where teachers are given the opportunity to authentically voice their opinions in a compassionate space, which again, we think about those attributes there: non-judgmental, sensitivity, empathy, being able to tolerate quite difficult feelings at times, in that sort of safe space is really important, because otherwise what we tend to do is take those difficult feelings away with us, and I think that's why some, I've had it myself, I've sort of continued to reflect on really difficult experiences over a weekend, for example. And although I think that's an important aspect of our role, I would have probably preferred the opportunity to have had the opportunity to talk about those experiences and try and draw on expertise of colleagues to help me kind of process and understand why I might have these feelings, or how those feelings might impact on my work, and so on. So I think I really hope that there becomes an increased recognition at the level of government. We might have representation from DFE here today. I don't know. I don't know the professional backgrounds of our attendees today, but if you are here, DFE, if you acknowledge the emotional work, which I think you need to, you're going to need to do something about it. And I think actually these kind of reflective spaces, or maybe more formal supervision, could provide a space for teachers to talk about this kind of stuff. Patrick, can I invite you in here? What kind of things were you reflecting on around that initial opening presentation?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's always so thought-provoking to think about how compassion is framed in a way beyond what the kind of everyday interpretation of it is. I think people think about compassion and they think about kindness. They think about sort of acts of charity, that kind of thing, which is obviously part of what compassion is. But what you've presented here is so much more complex than that, and it involves hardship. It involves uncomfortable moments. It involves to your point, Laura, kind of grown-up conversations where you have to kind of demonstrate a whole range of emotional competencies and be vulnerable, and do that work that then hopefully we can kind of model with the young people or the young adults that we work with. So that to me is a really kind of an interesting provocation to say, okay, what really is compassion, and what is involved in that kind of compassionate practice that isn't always easy, that's not always an act of kindness. I mean, I think another really interesting thing that struck me when you were talking was, trying to respond to your prompts, which I'm sure most people found quite hard. Can you actually think of a moment that immediately springs to mind when you were compassionate, or someone was compassionate to you, or you're compassionate to yourself? And I was surprised to find the example of emails coming into my head. A compassionate email, or a compassionate email sent to someone else, which just struck me as a reminder that compassionate practice is everywhere. We might be looking for the big gestures, but actually, compassion is a really boring everyday thing. And sometimes it struck me that you have to be attentive to how compassion interacts with the architecture of our practice. So that makes me think about to what extent is email designed to allow me to be compassionate to somebody else? To what extent is a meeting designed to allow for a compassionate conversation? Your example is fantastic, Laura, of how that architecture can be shaped to build that in. But I think, unfortunately, it's the exception, not the rule. And it raised some interesting thoughts around intellectual well-being, but I might save those for the time being and come back to them as we circle through the questions. But yeah, really thought-provoking stuff.
I mean, on response to your reflection on compassion, I think that's really interesting, because my research revealed that teachers are quite able to articulate how their colleagues' well-being might be looked after. So they can say, oh, well, school does this for them and does this for them. They talk less about how their own well-being is supported by schools, but they talk even less about how they look after their own well-being. And actually, my research was really revealing around, I mean, sadly, how teachers don't spend enough time looking after their own well-being. Actually, teachers were saying, well, actually, at the end of the day, I've got no energy. Actually, by the time I get home, I can barely make myself an evening meal, and then I want to go to bed. Actually, these are really important concerns. Actually, when we think about recruitment and retention in schools, and we think about the sort of concerns about the well-being of teachers, I think again, Laura's example might be an exception presently, but why is it that social workers have supervision? Why is it that psychologists have supervision? Why is it that therapists have supervision? It's because it's important. And actually, with the increase in the number of children exhibiting really quite complex needs around their social and emotional experiences, because of COVID, because of austerity, because of the digital space, whatever else, I'm not suggesting that teachers need to be therapists, but I'm saying that teachers are in a position where they are supporting the emotional well-being of children. I think they need more support, actually, because they are working in a very sort of empathetic, sensitive, and caring way with our children and young people.
And John, do you mind if I just jump in quickly to ask a question to Laura about this? Because it struck me from what you were saying, that sense of burnout. I mean, obviously we see it in the stats around teacher retention and recruitment and everywhere else, that well-being is a huge kind of sort of practical problem. It's a huge economic problem in terms of how in terms of the profession. And it strikes me that part of that is about that problem that you've articulated around productivity, that teachers are expected to be so productive that there just isn't the energy for anything to do with self-care, but also that it's about speed, it's about velocity of work, that everything needs to be done tomorrow and or today or yesterday. One of the kind of potential negatives of this whole AI explosion we've seen recently is that people think that the work is even easier to do. And they say, well, you've got these tools now, you need to actually be more productive, not less. And I just wanted to ask Laura, it strikes me that the spaces you were describing seem to kind of counterbalance that they slow things down, and they're not about productivity in the way that schools might normally think about productivity, but a different and actually much more powerful kind of productive work. So yeah, I just wanted to ask if that resonates with your practice that you were describing.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think that is the work. And I think, when I say, reflective space is built into our working day, this isn't after school hours or anything. This is built within our working day, as is supervision. And quite often when I'm going into schools to deliver supervision and to offer supervision to the staff there, they quite often say, well, I don't, we just haven't got the time, we haven't got the space, we haven't got the capacity to offer this. But what we're seeing is that people are walking out of education because they are done, they're finished, there's no more compassion left in them. And that's why, I completely agree with John that, I'd fight and talk to this, until my heart's content to try and get this actually into policy, because I think this has got to be built in. We've got to start looking after ourselves so that we can be the best we can be, because at the moment I really don't think that in education we can really say we're being the best we can be for the students and for ourselves. And so I think absolutely, yes, the pace of education, whether it's, young children, young adults, it's rapid, it's ever changing really, really quickly. But then there's also parts that have stayed still for a very, very long time. And actually we need a massive education reform. What we're doing now doesn't suit the cohort that we've got anymore. And, we should then be adapting and changing and things like that, but we're not. And so that's, I think there's got to be change, and change's got to come for us to be more successful and for us to bring the next lot of children up in a successful way as well. So, yeah, I completely agree that yesterday something had to be done, and it has to be done really instantly, but it is sometimes just about coming down and actually sitting back to reflect, and not just having that as your car journey home on your own.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to add a final thought there, the fact that most teachers, I think, will have come across reflective practice as part of an assessment regime, right? Which is an interesting, it's just interesting to think about how these terms get kind of, they get overshadowed by the architecture of the practice. So even though it's called reflective practice, often it's about getting from A to B via reflective practice, as opposed to what you're describing, which is making the reflection a focus in its own right. Yeah,
absolutely. And even the word supervision, many people don't understand what supervision is. I mean, I remember when I was first introduced to supervision, I thought I'd done something wrong. Do I now need to be supervised doing my job because I've done something wrong? And it's quite the opposite. It's again that very safe space to explore and think about the impact of the work. And that's not just working with complicated cases and children. That's working with everyone. You are going to feel something from every single job you do. It doesn't matter where you work, what sector you work, and you're always going to have some feeling, and it's always going to have some impact on you. So where do you take that? And that's where supervision comes in.
And I think, from my experience of supervision, what's useful is that these are non-agendered spaces. There is no kind of agenda to the regular opportunities to come together. You can bring, an issue that may have happened in the morning, it might have happened a week ago, but it's still this sort of regular safe space, which is an hour. Is that right, Laura?
Usually an hour, but sometimes they might go over if we try and keep time, and they're protected. I think that's the other thing, that it's a protected space. So if someone else suddenly says, oh, I need to have a meeting with you, I'm sorry, but I've got supervision, so it's going to have to fit around that. It's and it's the same for reflective spaces. It's formalized. You don't step into that actual room space when someone is having that supervision or that reflective space.
Yeah. Again, and they're kind of, they're very contained in the sense that actually what's talked about within those spaces probably stays within those spaces. Actually it's a space to really feel authentic and really feel honest. And that's why I think they have to be kind of supported in a very compassionate and sensitive way. Because, I mean, Patrick, you recognise that actually sharing some of these difficult feelings increases vulnerability, actually, but that's important to, I think, exhibit that vulnerability and to recognize that actually we're all the same in that sense. We have these feelings, we have these experiences, and those spaces can offer something really useful around understanding the work, which I think is really important. So again, I'm keeping an eye on our attendee chat and Q&A. We did have a few questions sent in before the session. I'll start moving through those now if we're happy to consider these. So, I mean, very interestingly, given what's happening this week nationally in terms of our schools. But our first question that we'd like to think about is, how can our education system evolve into one where children are recognised as individuals rather than judged on results? That's a big one. Who'd like to take the lead on that first question?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I mean, actually, I would maybe sort of gently disagree with that as a route to take. I mean, I absolutely agree that we should, we need to think very, very carefully about what knowledge production looks like in education these days. And so often there are two major sort of misunderstandings when it comes to discussions around education. I think the first one is that people mistake schooling for education. And clearly we can make a distinction between the institution of schooling and what happens there and the experience of education, which is all of our lives. And then I think there's often a misunderstanding between knowledge and knowledge production, and the fact that we can all be knowledgeable, but knowledge production happens in exams. Mm-hmm. And that's the production of very certain types of knowledge that then become representations of who we are. And of course, that's where the kind of the implications for well-being come in. So for that question, I absolutely agree that we need to be very careful about thinking differently about how we interpret what knowledge looks like. And of course, the kind of the revolution that we've seen in AI in the last few months could be a really positive challenge for that, in the same way that calculators were for maths a few decades ago. And I think maths teachers who were against calculators back in those days would have said, you need to learn to do mathematics in this way, because it's not like you're ever going to have, a calculator in your pocket every day. Yeah. But lo and behold, so I think that there is a big challenge there to say, well, knowledge production is changing very, very quickly, and I think that the forms of assessment that we're using now will seem extremely anachronistic very, very soon. And I'm sure the big exam houses are already working to figure out how they might do that differently. So absolutely, I think we need to, and we will see a shift away from thinking about assessing learning in the way that we currently are, which is, for all intents and purposes, 100 years out of date in my estimation. So the next question is about individuals, and I actually think that maybe is it could be challenged in so much as what we've seen in terms of youth activism in the last sort of half decade hasn't been about individuals at all. It's been about collectives. It's been about collaborative action. It's been about young people seeing themselves and seeing their futures, not about a single trajectory through the life course, not about individual gains, not even about individual well-being, but about a real sort of existential awareness of the collective. And saying, unless all of us together do something different, then, we're not going to have a conversation to have in a few generations' time. And so that I think is another interesting way to think about changing the record. If we move away from individual assessments, if we move away from an understanding of schooling as something that happens to individual people, if we move away from parents being worried about only their children. I was talking to some teachers the other day and asked them the question, when was the last time someone came into a parents' evening and said, how is my son's class doing? And that question doesn't really get asked, because understandably, that's not how our education system is organized at the moment. But I think a shift towards a sense of collective, of collective moving forward, not progress, but moving forward together. I may have just coined someone else's political phrase, I think it is a really kind of profound shift in how we think about education. Yeah.
And again, would have such a positive impact on the educational experiences of not only the children and young people, but the school community. I think that again is sort of part of the focus of today, is to think about how, as a community, we think more about this sort of way of interacting more compassionately with each other, and facilitate feelings of emotional safety and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's a really important response there, thinking about how current contemporary concerns might actually positively influence the educational experiences of our children and young people. I mean, the next question, Patrick, I think it's very much related to your academic interests, about futures. And this question asks, what's the best way to support students who see no future and don't have any goals? I mean, that's quite a powerful, it's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, but I think there is no more important question than that, right? To sort of say, okay, so what is happening for those young people that they don't see any future and they don't have any goals? I mean, I think a recent historical example of that would be the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, where traditionally you had a sort of to put it crudely, a culture of deference to your elders, what people might call a gerontocracy, right? This idea that you should respect your elders, and that the process of kind of transitioning through the life course is about going to university, getting a job, following a pattern. And in their resistance, and this is about Hong Kong's sort of political change in the last few years, those young people were saying, well, we have no future, so why wouldn't we fight in the present? And for older generations, that was a really, really difficult concept to try and consider, because they would say, what do you mean you don't have a future? You need to plan for your pension, get a mortgage, all of these things. But of course, if you're a young person living in the present and you see a completely moribund political system, or you see an existential crisis in terms of climate change, then I think it's absolutely justified to think that you have no future. And I think we might even complicate it one level further by saying, the version of the future that is often sold in schools is actually from the past, right? So the idea of the future that we often see in schools is that if you work really hard at school and you pass your exams and you get to go to university, you get to go to a job, you'll make some money, you'll have a comfortable life, and then we go through all the other things that people expect in the life course. But of course, that isn't the reality that most young people experience. Everybody who is a young person today in school has grown up in the era of the financial crisis, of the pandemic, of post-truth, of populism, of the Ukraine conflict. The cornerstone of their experience of life is uncertainty. So I think it's absolutely understandable that somebody would think, I have no future, if the future I'm being presented with is one that is, from the 1950s. Yeah. But there is a positive outcome of that discussion, I think, which is to say, if not that future, then what future? And there is a really exciting prospect there, I think, in saying, the future is not just one thing. It's not just a shadow that is there waiting to kind of, to kind of eclipse the present. The future is there to be made, and it's there to be made in the present. And so I think different kinds of future thinking can actually be really exciting. So I think when it comes to practically, what do you say to a kid who says, I've got no future? Well, you say, well, what future do you want? And how do we make it happen? So it's that kind of, to an extent, it comes back to that idea of intellectual well-being, the idea that, it's all well and good to think about what you think is an ethical way to be. It's a whole different thing to act in an ethical way. And in making that leap from what you think is good to actually acting it out is future making right there.
And again, our audience must check out your work around, future aspirations and so on, because I think they're really important projects for, to involve young people in the opportunity to talk about what they hope and aspire to in the future, and as you say, make moves towards those kind of future aspirations, which are really I think is very important. Laura, if I could come to you next, is a question that says, I would love to hear your thoughts or guidance on using our knowledge to implement this approach wider for other colleagues or whole school organisations. So, I mean, I know you're very interested in the sort of whole school organisational approach. What kind of advice would you give our attendee in that response to that question?
Are we talking specifically about compassion, would you say?
I think potentially around maybe the emotional aspects of the work, maybe around supporting staff well-being. I think the presentation was school plus compassion equals well-being, but it's about this sort of colleague or whole school approach, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's about building that into the culture and basically creating culture carriers who are going to carry that. And I think quite often in schools, that's very much fed from the top down. So you've got to have your leadership team fully in that sort of having that understanding of what compassion is and what that looks like. I think the cupcake quote that you had up is you know, that's an interesting one, because compassion looks very different for everyone. And I think actually sometimes having those honest and open conversations of what is it that you need? What do you need? What does compassion look like for you? It means something different to everyone. But, you know, not necessarily thinking about the physicalities of having cakes in the staff room or things like that. It's thinking about, okay, so when are we going to do those informal check-ins? Or, oh, I noticed someone was a bit upset yesterday, let me go and check in with them today, or drop them a text in the evening just to checking in, because those are the things that are actually really going to matter and make the difference. And I think, you know, looking again at your whole school policy, so thinking about your relational, you know, have you got a behavior policy, have you got a relational policy, what's your policies with parents, thinking about that wider community as well, and building compassion into those so that it becomes really that whole school sort of ethos and just the norm, which means that once it's sort of fed through the school, it will then reach the children and the parents and the families, which will have that wider impact. I'm just thinking at the moment, so we're currently, you mentioned earlier, I'm working on the Nurture project, which is we're delivering training alongside Nurture UK, which specifically looks at the social and emotional well-being of children. But also within the project, we're looking very much at the adults and actually the impact of the training that we're delivering and what that has on the adults. Does it mean that they feel more upskilled and able to reflect and think about, you know, the difficulties and the complexities to the work? So I think it's very much about creating that compassionate culture, but also providing time and space to reflect and not rush and run through things.
I mean, again, I think, you know, that's so powerful, isn't it? That actually there has to be an established culture of recognizing, you know, these sort of feelings that teachers might have and doing something about it, you know. And I think if you're working in an organization where you're not encouraged to talk about feelings, and I have been in examples where, you know, schools aren't interested in the emotional aspect of the work, actually you're here to teach, you know, sort of get on with it or leave kind of thing, that's when they don't retain teachers. They don't retain good teachers because good teachers care, you know. And I think good teachers think a lot about the children, you know. They think about children's past experiences, they think about what's happening with the children currently, they often think about children's future experiences as well. And I think all that kind of stuff, you know, you need that space. But as you say, it takes, I think, leadership. And I think it's that sort of whole school culture. You use the phrase culture keepers, and I really like that phrase. I know that's a particular sort of Mulby Bush phrase who have very good retention rates for staff that work there, because there's this kind of ethos and culture of a shared understanding which is created over time, I think, isn't it, actually? And that's the concern about, you know, the sort of the quick turnaround for some teachers in schools, that actually we need to really strengthen the culture and community in our schools. Yeah, Patrick, you're nodding along there. Would you like to add something there at all about the sort of cultural aspect, maybe?
Yeah, well, it just struck me when you were talking, Laura, that there's that feeling, that there's that tension, I guess, between you know, when this is done well and it really works, and then you know, when sort of lip service is paid to it and it actually makes the problem worse. You know, back to your quote, John, and I'm sure, you know, a lot of people have seen that kind of performance of affect, maybe especially from leadership, where there's a sense that you need to come into the room and show that you're compassionate, but the practice doesn't actually reflect anything deeper. And so I think there is something you know, complicated there around how things like compassion or reflection can actually be kind of wielded against people, unfortunately, and actually kind of, you know, sort of recreate the problems that they were looking to solve in the first place. So yeah, I'm really interested in that, you know, that what you were describing about how it works authentically, how you actually get people to maybe back to that point about the, you know, the relationship between ethical thinking and ethical action, how you get people to really seriously think about what they want to do and then see them actually acting on those points of principle. So, which I'm sure is a hard, you know, that's a challenge.
And I think, you know, there's an element as well of leaders thinking about, okay, so what do I want my school to look like? And because, you know, quite a lot of the conversations around compassion and well-being often always comes around teacher workload. So what can they do to support their teachers to have a better well-being? Is it that they're going to have, I don't know, a no marking policy? Is it that they're going to say you're going to have 2 PPA sessions a week? I mean, that would be luxury, and a lot of teachers would jump at that. But it's those things as well, thinking about how can we lighten that load, and then actually in the classroom and for the people that we're working with, what does that look like? Are we purely going to focus on all the academics, or actually are we trying to create these sort of well-rounded human beings who are able to develop their resilience and their own compassion? But that's got to be almost taught and modelled to them. You know, it's got to be quite explicit to the children for us to, you know, to show that, and they learn from the role modelling. So we've got to embed it into our adult group for it then to be role modelled through the children. And, you know, thinking about the emotional and social, you know, aspects of the work, you know, specifically, okay, how are you feeling? Talking about emotions. I know zones of regulation is used in many schools now, quite often in the primary schools, but I know it's going into secondaries as well. And learning it with those emotions. So, and identifying them and just recognizing those with the children, I think is so powerful. And actually it's something that adults quite often can't do. You know, we might be really, really cross, but sitting and recognizing and thinking, what is it that I'm cross about, or where have I picked up this feeling, and why is it coming out? You know, I think that's something that's really important.
No, I'd agree. Yeah. And we've got a couple of comments from our audience as well. I'm interested in the evidence on this, as it's a long-held belief of my school that a safe space is a productive space. That's, you know, I think again it sort of summed up some of the thinking for today. Another comment here: as educators, compassion is crucial in the school settings, and I would completely agree with that. So I mean, I've you know, had some thoughts here about questions that we might consider, and I think actually we've really kind of thought through those questions by responding to our you know, audience's questions. Again, I'm you know, for those of you still in attendance, I am still keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. If you have any other questions, you know, as we begin to conclude this afternoon's session, if I may, I'd just like to offer some thoughts in terms of a kind of you know, summary, really, in terms of you know, perhaps, you know, where we've come through in our thinking today. And I think it is really important around, this is about community. As Patrick said, it's not about individuals here. This is about working together. It's about thinking together. It's about talking together. And my doctoral research sort of concluded with this sort of notion of compassion-focused education. And I'd just like to sort of give an insight into what that, you know, look like from my perspective, really. But it's really thinking about how compassion might inform our pedagogy, you know, the way we design learning experiences, the way we interact with our children, young people, or for Patrick and I, adults, you know, in an educational context that can, you know, increase anxiety. Actually, you know, learning is often quite uncomfortable, and I think that is an important aspect of learning, but that we create a space where it's okay to experience that discomfort. I certainly did over the last well, throughout my academic career. Actually, I think I think that's important. How compassionate might inform our practice. You know, again, the way we work with our students, the way we encourage them to engage authentically and to be able to talk about their lived experiences. I think that, you know, in safe educational spaces, and also to be able to, you know, talk about things that might be kind of controversial with others. How we might, you know, think about how compassion might inform our curriculum. I mean, everything I talk about at Oxford Brookes University is about inclusion. It's about diversity. It's about equitable educational experiences, about, you know, critiquing educational experiences. So I think, you know, that's really kind of important. Laura mentioned there, do we have behaviour policies, or do we have relational, you know, policies around how we think about and how we respond to children's behaviour? Do we see it as confrontation, or do we see it as actually a child experiencing potentially quite high levels of distress? How might compassion inform our kind of responses to children's behaviour? And I think that kind of leads into compassion-focused, I'd say, school cultures, but that certainly we can create those cultures in our own classrooms, and that I think leads to, you know, sort of, you know, teaching and learning, pedagogy informed by compassion. So again, a focus there on kind of compassion-focused education. And again, I'd encourage you to think about how you might join this revolution. I think it's really kind of important. I also think that this compassion focused education must be founded on certain principles, that actually all our endeavours around education aim to facilitate the well-being of ourselves and others. I'm not sure that happens all the time, but I think we could be doing better at that actually. And that I think can be around empathetic connection with others, exhibiting care for others, like Laura suggests, little things, just checking in with our colleagues. How are you doing today? Genuinely interested in being open and kind of present for others. Showing an awareness of difficulties in ourselves and others and talking about those is really important. And that whole motivation aspect of compassion there is to prevent initially, I think, any sort of difficulties. But if people are experiencing those, how can we alleviate, or support? And how can we engage in activities that are actually, healthy and helpful? How can we interact more compassionately so that, our colleagues and our children and young people or our students feel cared for? Actually, a phrase from my doctoral research was about showing care and concern for others. I thought that was a really nice phrase. I thought, really, really important. There are loads of initiatives happening across schools and universities that kind of support well-being authentically. And, I think it's really important that we continue to think about things in education that have the intention of promoting, encouraging and facilitating well-being in ourselves and others. I think that's really kind of important. And we amplify those, we do more of them actually. So we further enhance experiences that genuinely help and facilitate well-being. Sometimes I think we can act as filters, particularly for kind of senior leaders, or we've got opportunities to think about, anticipate that things might have a negative impact on others and really think about how we might reconsider those experiences, adapt them to eliminate or reduce the impact. And something I'm really, keen to encourage is resistance. Actually, we've got to stop doing things that have a negative impact, so we've got to prevent, things that might experience difficulties or distress in others. I think that's really important, actually, that we kind of, I was thinking really carefully about this notion of encouraging compassion, but I think I want to incite compassion. That's how I feel about this. I think it's so important, actually, that we really do, think about that together. And that for me is what this kind of compassionate revolution is all about, actually. So there's my thoughts. I really like this image here, actually, that, culture of school and classroom is the shadow of the teachers. I think that's really true. I'm embarrassed that I should be able to cite that image, but I've had it a long time. I don't know where I got it from. And this is, I think, for me, a really kind of important quotation. This is Professor Paul Gilbert and Choden. So I actually think we need more non-conformity in education. I think I'd encourage all teachers to be more non-conformist, actually. We need to experience, this sort of compassionate non-conformity in education, more resistance and so on. So just a little bit of self-promotion. If you're interested in sort of emotional development attachment, this is an excellent book, Cooper and Colley, Colley and Cooper rather. Really practical advice there around supporting emotional development and attachment in the classroom. And I've got a chapter in this second book here around mental health and wellbeing in school. That's a kind of critique really about how we respond to children with complex needs. I don't think compliance and control works very well. I think we should be more caring and compassionate. And there's a link to my doctoral research if you're interested, where I've talked quite a lot about this sort of stuff. And then the last couple of pages there are references. They're often open access, so I hope you kind of I hope they're useful for you. So yeah, that's essentially potentially a good place to conclude our session today. Again, I've kept an eye out for any kind of questions in the chat or the Q&A. So I think we've kind of managed to respond to those, and we aim to finish between 6 and 15:15. So I think we've done that successfully. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking our audience for attending this afternoon. I know how busy your professional lives are, so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I found this a really engaging opportunity to explore the importance of compassion in education. So I'd like to also thank our panel this afternoon. So thank you very much, Laura Dennis from the Mulberry Bush organisation. Have a look at their website. Do get in contact with Laura about any aspect of supporting children with more complex profiles. I know you and the Marlborough Bush are very keen to offer support for local and now national and potentially international educational organisations. And again, thank you, Professor Patrick Alexander. It's been really great to have you here this afternoon. And again, check out Patrick's work, very much around young people's sort of future aspirations, really, isn't it? Thinking really carefully about their future and so on. And again, if Oxford Brookes University can help you with any kind of research initiatives that you'd be keen for us to support with, do contact Professor Patrick Alexander, our Director of Research and Consultancy at Oxford Brookes University. I should also probably thank my colleague Will for organising, and Laura and Georgia for organising this event this afternoon. Very, very kind. And this session has been recorded, and we will be able to share the recording with those of you that signed up and have been unable to make it for whatever reason. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon's webinar, and do keep an eye out for other kind of Think Human events that you might be interested in participating in. So now go and spend a bit of time thinking about showing compassion to yourselves, and go and do something nice at the end of a busy day. I'm going to be taking a walk at some point this afternoon, and that's how I'm going to reflect and think about this afternoon's conversation. So I'll thank our audience again, and I hope you found that interesting and engaging. I'll say goodbye for now.